Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I'll be reconstructing my 24.00 official FMC mean that I got at FMC World 2026. I'm really happy with this mean as I learned DRHDR in January and had many fails to get a good mean. And I'm really glad that I finally got a mean that represents what I average. Without any further ado, let's start with the first solve. Alright, so starting off on the first scramble here, the EO counts are 644 and it looks quite nice. There's some like DR blocky patterns here. So, first off, I started on white front, and the bad edges are here, 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 and here. So with this, you have two different 3-move VOs. You have F2 L prime D, and you have L prime F2 D. So already, that's two 3-move VOs, and you can extend those to a lot of different 4-movers. However, what I ended up doing is I just ended up starting on this 3-mover right here, L prime F2 D. As if you take a look after L prime F2D, you can see there's pre-made RZP on this axis here. There's 4 corners here and 2 edges here. The case looks really awful on this side of a scramble, so I decided to switch to the inverse. Alright, so we're on the inverse now, and the case looks a lot better, as there's this pair right here. This case doesn't look that amazing, however, it is RZP in 3, so it's worth writing down stuff off it anyway. Anyways, so to start off solving with RZP, I decided to pair this corner with this block here, do D2, R2 to make this, as you can see here. And then I paired this corner with this edge with an D2. And then I matched this with these E layer edges with an F. Then you can solve to DR by doing L2, B, L2 to pair this, and then B prime R. And that is DR. After making this DR, I checked and spammed some stuff and realized that the case was 4B2, 4E, meaning that it is 2 quarter turns away from DR and there are 4 edges out of place. These cases are worse than 4B2, 2E, however, it's worth checking them anyway, as they can be really good. And in this particular circumstance, it actually works out to be really good. Here, you can notice if you do a U2 here, you have the pre-setup trigger of R, F2, U2, R, in this case mirrored to the left side. So you do a U2, then do B prime, R2, D2, B. That is HTR in 18 moves. After that, I decided to check this HTR, and I noticed that if you do R2, B2, you get floppy reduction. After making floppy reduction, I took a look here and noticed that the case looks pretty good. So if you do R2, L2, D2, that is sleeve slice in 22 moves. This is really good, as my PR single at the time was in fact 22 moves. So I was like, yay, I probably got PR with this, or potentially. Not guaranteed, because 2 quarter turn DRs typically often don't give +0. However, if you look here, the D2 and the D prime cancel with each other on both different sides of a scramble, meaning that in reality it is sliced in 21. After this, I checked for VRs. I noticed that if you widen the B prime R2 D2B as BY prime R2 D2 BY R2 D2 R2 D2, it gives VR. You have this sort of cycle here afterwards, and if you do D2, R2, L2, B2, and instead of widen the B2 like this, L2, R2, D2, you just have an S2 left. The main reasoning for widening the B2 is so that you don't have a case where you need 2 different double slice insertions to solve the rest of the cube. However, in this case, it literally just gives an S2. However, unfortunately, after you do this VR and you try and solve it, you cannot actually solve it in +1. It will take 2 moves to solve, which means that we have to check VRs in +1 now. The VR in +1 that I decided to go with was doing U2 BY prime, but instead of just doing that, you rewrite the BY prime as BY B2. So here, U2 BY B2, and then R2 B2 BY R2, the rest is normal, and then you just solve the cube from there. It gives a 23-move solution, which ends up actually being a 22 because of this cancellation right here by doing this. So I was really happy with that as I tie my PR cycle on the very first solve of the competition. Alright, so here's a second scramble. Starting off, I noticed that this scramble is quite insane. There are already a lot of 4-movers on this scramble, and I immediately noticed 2 3-movers, giving a lot of 4-move VO extensions. As you can see, I literally only wrote 4-movers for the scramble. That's how crazy it was. Anyway, I started off on this EO here. As you can see, there are 2 edges on the FB axis, and I did this nothing move of U prime and did B prime T2 B to get EO. If you take a look here, there's quite a few pairs here, and It's almost JZP actually, but what I ended up doing is just an L move, and that gives RZP in 5 with mad pairs. After doing that, you can just solve DR simply in 4 moves by doing a U prime F2 to make this pair and set up the edges and do DR. And that is DR in 9 moves. And the DR is also 1/4 turn, which is a really, really good DR. Unfortunately, there are only 6 edges at a place, but it's still an amazing DR to get 1/4 turn corners and 9 moves. There are a bunch of ways to solve the HDR here in a short number of moves, but I ended up switching to the normal anyway. Alright, so we're on the normal scramble now, and what I ended up doing is I just ended up doing L2D to solve the quarters and get only 2 edges at a place. And then here, you solve the DR by doing L2U, and then F2, L2, F2, sort of thing where you do that to solve that one edge, and then a U. And that is HDR in 17 moves. On top of that, when looking at the HDR, you can see it is 1 move to a 2E2E pattern. And if you know your 2E2Es, just like this specific 2E2E case, you'll know that you can actually cancel this move out with widening moves. And therefore, it is 5 more moves to leave slice. Here, I just played around for a bit, but what I ended up going with is L2, B2, R2, F2, R2, and that is leave slice in 22 moves. However, the R2 and the R cancel with each other, and it is leave slice in 21. Alright, so when solving the slice, if you widen this U move with the last U move here, so you do L2D, L2, U wide, L2, 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 U wide, L2, L2, R2, that is a VR. And here, if you insert an E2 with the last U move here, R2, F2, R2, E2, L2, E2, R2, that solves the slice in +1 for a 22 move solution. After that, I was really, really happy and really nervous as I had 2 tied PR singles in a row. I actually only needed a 37 to meet my PR mean of 27.00, and it was also a really bad PR mean, so I really, really, really wanted to get something decent on the next scramble. Alright, so here's the 3rd scramble. Funnily enough, this scramble was actually an extra attempt as one of the organizers messed up. Anyways, looking on the scramble, the EO counts are quite bad. They're 868, and this scramble is quite terrible. I could not find any linear form of EOs, and I only ended up finding, I think it was 3 NIS EOs. So overall, this scramble was really, really bad. There were in fact so few 5-movers that I decided to actually write some NIS 5-move EOs. Alright, so starting off with the normal scramble here, there are 8 bad edges on FB axis. And if you do an F, there are now 4 bad edges. These edges are not in the worst position to get a 5-move EO. In fact, there are quite a bunch of them, as you can see here. However, I also ended up NIS tracing these edges to see what I would get. After NIS tracing the edges, you can see they're here, 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 and here. And if you do a D move with this edge, moving them to be here, that's a crap load of 5-move EOs that are possible with that. There are also, in fact, 2 different 4-move NIS EOs by doing R2 D prime B and D prime R2 B. However, I didn't end up doing that. We're on the inverse scramble now after switching off that EO, and I will show you why there are so many 5-movers here. As you can see, if you do a D, you can notice that you have the edges in this shape, which means U2 L2 sets them up, or L2 U2, or R2 D2, or D2 R2. So that's a crap load of EO possibilities. What I ended up actually going with is doing D and then L2 U2 F. It doesn't look that great, but here, if you do an R prime, that is actually RZP in 6 moves. And if you do F2 B2 to make this block here, you're only 2 moves away from DR. This is DR in 10 moves, however, unfortunately, it is a 4C4 case, which is a really, really bad subset. However, everything else I checked on the scramble was terrible, so I just decided to end up safety solving this in the end. I actually miscounted the DR as 11 moves rather than 10, so at the end of my solve, I actually thought it was 1 move worse than what I actually got, so I was pleasantly surprised at the end. Anyways, I tried solving this DR, and it ended up being terrible. Here, if we do F2 U, you reduce to 4C3, and if you do D2 D prime, that is a 4v2 case with 2 edges misplaced. That is one of the best cases that you can get. There's an HDR solution of doing D prime, but I ended up canceling a D prime and just doing a D2 to do a different HDR solution. So here, if you can notice, pair this up with B2, then you do U2, R2, sets up the trigger, then you have U, R2, U, and that is HDR. This is HDR in 20 moves, which of course is not great, but this scramble is ludicrously bad. So I decided I would take it. After making HDR, you can make floppy reduction by doing R2, F2, D2, and then this case is quite bad. It is L2, B2, L2, B2, F2, and that is leaf slice in 27. I actually thought it was slice in 29 it was all for some reason. I don't know, I was confused. I later ended up recounting it thinking it was slice in 28 because I miscounted my DR as 11 moves instead of 10, but in reality, it was slice in 27. However, this slice is actually terrible. There is no +0 solutions off of this 4¼ turn slice, which is really unfortunate. I actually ended up looking for a blocky fish to rewrite this slice here. You have this sort of blocky fish-like pattern here. So if you undo it, you do D, you have a blocky fish. If you do U prime, L2, D2, F2, D, that is a different leaf slice entirely. I tried solving that, and what did it give? No +0 solutions. Quite unfortunate. So I'm checking for +1s here, and because I have about 7 minutes left on my slice, I decided to use the blocky fish. And here, you have this nice VR over there. So I wrote it down on a certain piece of paper, because the paper was getting quite cramped. This is what it looks like. So you go back in your solution, you widen out as D2, which does no moves, and then what you can do is you can insert an E2 right here. E2. That solves our slice in +1. That ended up giving me a 28 move final solution. Overall, I'm quite happy with this mean. I'm really glad that I managed to hold it together for the last attempt for such a bad scramble after getting 2 back-to-back PR singles, and I definitely hope that I can beat this sometime soon. I have a lot of potential in this event, and I'm glad that I finally showed it with this mean. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.